Tesla has finally done it. We've now got the long-range rear-wheel drive Model 3. Not only does it offer the best electric range in the lineup, but it offers class-leading electric range in comparison to some of its competitors. More on that shortly. Now, at the time of filming and in the UK, the entry-level rear-wheel drive Tesla Model 3 can be found for £40,000. If you go for the long-range model, which we have on review, it'll cost you £45,000. If you then go for the long-range all-wheel drive, it will set you back £50,000, and then the long-range performance model comes in at £60,000. So in this review, you can see if this model is worth its price tag and how it compares with the other vehicles, all of which I have already reviewed, and of course, some of its key competitors. So let's kick things off and talk about what's most important, and of course, by that I mean its electric range. Now, it is claimed to have an 82 kilowatt hour battery pack. I say claimed because the manufacturer has not actually shared that data with us. It is what you can find online and what is presumed over the previous generation models as well. Now, nonetheless, you have got a heat pump that comes included as standard across the entire trim range, which is certainly appreciated as it allows better efficiency on those colder climate days when it comes to heating up the cabin. Now, in terms of the WLTP range claims by the manufacturer, via the Tesla website, I was able to see that the long-range rear-wheel drive sits at a shockingly high 436 miles. While the all-wheel drive model goes to 390 miles, the performance model goes down to 328 miles, and then the entry-level rear-wheel drive with the smaller battery pack sits at 318 miles. Now, from my own mixed driving test of the long-range rear-wheel drive, which is on review, I netted 320 to 340 miles, which is indeed the highest range that I have attained in any single vehicle, be it an SUV or saloon, and yes, indeed, this vehicle reigns supreme in this department. It's almost no surprise. Now, by looking at the mileage leaderboard, you might be wondering, how does this compare with the other new Tesla Model 3s that I have tested? Well, the long-range all-wheel drive netted 310 to 330 miles. The performance model sat at 255 to 275 miles, while the entry rear-wheel drive model sat at 225 to 245 miles. Now, yes, indeed, you might be wondering, why on earth is it that the long-range rear-wheel drive doesn't perform all that much better than the all-wheel drive alternative? And the answer is actually quite simple. For some odd reason, this press vehicle has been fitted with the less efficient 19-inch Nova rims, and therefore it does actually affect the overall range by roughly 30 to 40 miles. Indeed, even if you look at Tesla's website, the standard 18-inch Photon rims get better electric range, and that is where the utmost electric range claim actually comes from. Now, what I'm trying to say over here is that if you were to go for the standard configuration, you should be able to expect roughly 340 to 370 miles, which not only far surpasses any of its key competitors, but will set itself in a completely different league, even when compared to the other Tesla Model 3s in the lineup. Now, for you to be as efficient as possible, you'll want to recoup energy back into the battery pack. And here you've only got a singular regenerative braking mode, which in my opinion is actually quite disappointing. As a result over here, if I were to lift off the accelerator pedal at 30 miles an hour, the vehicle will actually come to a complete standstill. Now, while I really do love the one-pedal driving approach, it would have been great to see an option, because in the older generation Tesla Model 3s, before the firmware updates, you actually had the mode selector, and therefore you could still have it kind of coast. And some of its competitors also offer some paddle shifters which allow you customization on the fly. The reason I'm pointing this out is because while it's all very well and good within the city, when it comes to going on the motorway, it does become cumbersome because you have to constantly apply pressure on the accelerator pedal, therefore making it a little bit more laborious. Now, of course, you do also have the ability of plugging it in, and here you have got up to 250 kilowatts of input charge, and therefore if you connect up to a V3 supercharger, you can go from 10 to 80% in 25 to 30 minutes. As for a V2 supercharger, which will be capped at 150 kilowatts, it will take you roughly 40 minutes to attain the same level of charge. As for a more commonly found 50 kilowatt charger, like you'd find on the motorway, it will take you roughly 1 to 2 hours. Now, all the Tesla Model 3s do come fitted with an 11 kilowatt onboard charger, and therefore via the Type 2 port you can go from 10 to 100% in roughly 8 to 9 hours, while a 3-pin input will take you a whopping 45 hours instead. Now, what I really do love when it comes to the overall charging and the overall experience that you get within the Tesla is the fact that you've got fantastic route planning that's done via the infotainment system, which also reads the state of charge. And of course, you have got access to Tesla's supercharger network, which just takes the stress away when it comes to doing those longer journeys, because you can pretty much rely on those superchargers actually working. And when you do actually get to those superchargers, you'll probably have a charger available to you. So aside from efficiency, what about when it comes to performance? Well, here yet again, the manufacturer has not shared any details in terms of how powerful the long-range rear-wheel drive is, although they did share some details on the performance model, claiming that it's got 343 kilowatts of power or 460 horsepower. Nonetheless, all the Model 3s feel pretty nippy, even the entry-level rear-wheel drive. Now, what I have got is some test data for you. Using RaceLogic's Performance Box Touch, I had the long-range rear-wheel drive tested from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 1.53 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 2.33 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 5.35 seconds, and in case you're wondering, that is pretty much in line with what I would expect, because the all-wheel drive model netted 4.29 seconds, the rear-wheel drive model netted 6 seconds, while the performance model netted a whopping 3.19 seconds. As for 50 to 70 miles an hour, it only took 2.8 seconds, and I also recorded a peak acceleration of 0.66 Gs. Now, it's also worth considering over here that all the Tesla Model 3s, apart from the performance model, have got a top speed of 125 miles an hour, with the performance model offering 163 miles an hour. If you do have the ability of driving on unrestricted roads, that might come in pretty handy. Now, aside from its straight line speed, what about when it comes to its handling characteristics? Well, the Tesla Model 3 lineup isn't exactly renowned for the utmost driver's input. It doesn't compete with the likes of the Polestar 2 or the BMW i4, let alone the class-leading Porsche Taycan, but I do appreciate that's a completely different price category. Now, nonetheless, the vehicle still does feel pretty fun to drive. You've got a twitchy steering wheel, which can be customized via the infotainment system in terms of the stiffness that it offers. And then you've also got a really planted design, which, due to its low center of gravity, means that when you're going to be chucking around winding country routes, it does actually feel still pretty responsive. Now, on that note, the vehicle is indeed operating on a rear-wheel drive configuration, and despite that fact, you've got fantastic level of traction and grip. Of course, if you're going to be putting your foot down to the metal from a standstill on wet tarmac, or for example exiting a bend, then the back end does lose itself a little bit, and therefore in comparison to, for example, the all-wheel drive model, it can't quite compete. But in the grander scheme of things, I don't suspect most people will be driving it like a lunatic, like I did sometimes when going around roundabouts. Now, what is more important, however, is the overall driving comfort. See, here it has the same sort of suspension system that's found on the other Model 3s, and due to the omission of a front-mounted motor like you'd find on the all-wheel drive alternatives, but then a larger battery pack, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. See, if you're going over challenging terrain, you'll feel that the front end is constantly bouncing because there's no extra weight that kind of keeps it down. On the flip side, it does mean that when you're just going to be pottering around town, it does do a decent job of soaking up those anomalies of speed bumps and potholes. Make no mistake, however, it's not going to compete with the performance model, which has got a more advanced suspension system, and including some of its rivals, for example the BMW i4 with its fantastic adaptive air suspension system, which does a phenomenal job of giving you a really nice planted feel, all while feeling really comfortable even when you're pottering around town. Now, another important factor when it comes to the overall driving comfort is cabin noise, and thankfully over here the long-range rear-wheel drive is very much similar to the other Model 3s in that it does actually give you a pretty serene in-cabin experience. There's some detailed measurements, if you are interested about them, on my audio reviews, which you can find up on your pop banner or by following the links down in the description below or the pinned comments. Effectively over here it does actually do pretty well both at lower and higher speeds. Now, in terms of the overall interior design, it is actually very much identical, other than the fact that the performance model does actually have a slightly different look to it, and that is namely due to the seats. And here you have got an all black interior, although you can go for the white finish, which is pictured, and that'll set you back an additional £1,100. In terms of the materials that have been used around the cabin, I've got no real complaints, but indeed over here it's not going to compete with some of the more premium offerings that give you a bit more of that luxury look and feel. Now, looking around the cabin, you will have noticed that there is no instrument cluster or a head-up display, which in my opinion is a mistrick by the manufacturer, because they could have at least added it as an option for those people who want it. See here, if you want to check your traversing speed or the safety systems that are in operation, you have to glance towards the center of the dashboard and indeed look at the 15.4-inch landscape display. And yes, that also includes your speedometer, which is positioned at the top right-hand side. So therefore, you're taking your eyes further away from the road every single time in order for you to avoid getting any sort of speeding fines. Now, when it comes to the display itself, it is super responsive. I've got no complaints in this department. And when it comes to the use of infotainment, by that I mean when you've got the entertainment apps, the arcades, the games, and all that stuff to play around with, I do think Tesla are absolutely class leading and head and shoulders above some of their competitors. It is really fantastic to see. Now, the climate controls are also very intuitive to use, and yes, alas, they are all done digitally, and therefore you have not got any sort of physical controls. Now, another thing I should point out is that the display serves as your drive mode selector. So yes, indeed, if you want to go into drive, you swipe up. If you want to go into reverse, you swipe down, and you can tap to park. It is actually quite intuitive while you get your head around it. And there's also a feature called auto shift, which will automatically do that for you when you are at a standstill. For example, when you power on the vehicle for the first time, it'll be using the camera-based system to determine what is best to use. But of course, double check that before you actually press on the accelerator pedal, before you go, for example, into a car or into a wall. Now, in case you're wondering if the screen were to ever fail, you have also got some overrides that can be found by the headliner. This allows you to operate the basic controls, for example, drive, neutral, and reverse, and therefore means that if you do have to drive to a Tesla service center, then you can always do so, even if you don't have a center display. Speaking of which, you also have a rear 8-inch display, which is really nice and vivid, and a great inclusion specifically at this price point. See, a lot of its competitors often charge for more for this sort of feature, and while others won't even include a rear display altogether. The display effectively gives you climate controls and also media controls for your rear occupants, and therefore is a really nice inclusion by the manufacturer. Now, what I don't like, however, is the fact that you have not got any sort of traditional stalks. Yes, indeed, when it comes to your indicators, they're all done by the buttons that are found on the steering wheel. And while this might seem intuitive to certain individuals, for example, those who live in the US, and therefore you're not really treated by any sort of roundabouts, in the UK and around Europe, I do think it's really counterintuitive. Now, some people have disagreed with me in the past by saying this, but in my opinion, it still feels too polarizing. In fact, Tesla have actually answered my query in this respect and kind of agreed with me by releasing the new Tesla Model Y with an indicator stalk. So why on earth would they have done that if they thought that the target market didn't actually want an indicator stalk in the first place? So in my opinion, these comments are justified. Having no indicator stalk is a point of failure because there are touch-based buttons that are found on a steering wheel, and also just less intuitive to use, specifically if you're going in and around roundabouts. Now, one thing that I really do like, however, is the fact that you have got a really punchy and exciting sounding 9-speaker audio system that comes fitted as standard in the long-range rear-wheel drive. So yes, in case for those people who are wondering, the long-range rear-wheel drive shares the same audio system as you'll find in the entry-level rear-wheel drive Tesla Model 3. If, however, you want a superior audio listening experience and you want dual subwoofers in the boot, for example, you'll want to go for the all-wheel drive models, and that also includes the performance variant as well. So effectively, what I'm trying to say over here is that if you're really an audiophile, then you might want to consider splashing out that extra bit of money to get that all-wheel drive configuration for the audio system alone. But the entry-level Tesla Model 3 still does a tremendous job, specifically if you compare and contrast it with some of its key competitors. So next up we get onto storage, which is actually class leading within the cabin. First off, you have got the glove box, which has got a magnetic feel to it. Here you'll also find a USB Type-A port, which is useful for plugging in a flash drive for your dashcam footage or for playing back high-res audio files. Then towards the center console, you've got 2 wireless charging bays with a nice felt material as well, which means that it just feels a little bit more premium. Then further down, you've got a retractable area where you'll find a 12-volt socket, and it's nice to see it has actually been lined in fabric as well, which prevents any loose keys and change from rattling about. Then further down, you've got 2 cup holders, and then you've got the center armrest compartment, which is actually pretty sizable. Here you'll also find a high-speed USB Type-C port, which is useful for charging only, and it will deliver up to 65 watts of power. The same could be said at the rear of the center console, where you've got a further 2 USB Type-C ports for your rear occupants. As for the door bins, all of them have been lined in fabric, which is certainly appreciated, and the front 2 are large enough to accommodate a 500ml bottle alongside some small to medium-sized valuables. As for the rear, the door bins are unsurprisingly a bit more limited, but you do have a pull-down armrest compartment which reveals 2 cup holders. Now, of course, when it comes to storage, we have to talk about its boot, and here you've got a pretty sizable 594 litres to play around with, and it's presumed that this figure extends up to roughly 1,300 to 1,400 litres when you drop down the seats. Indeed, this figure has not been shared by the manufacturer. Nonetheless, it's actually plentiful. You've got a lot of storage for your weekly shops, or indeed for taking large luggage. In terms of practicality, you've got 60/40 rear split folding seats, and no, you don't have an integrated ski latch, which is slightly a shame. Nonetheless, you have got a huge underfloor compartment, which will suffice for your charging cables, and a flat loading bay. There's also an electric tailgate that comes fitted as standard across the entire trim range. Although it's worth mentioning over here that you do not have a hatchback design, making it a little less practical in comparison to some of its key competitors. Elsewhere, you do also have an 88-litre front capacity. That's the area that's found underneath the front bonnet. It's worth noting, however, that the bonnet can only be electronically opened via the app or via the infotainment system, but you will have to be manually closed. So just something worth pointing out, that it's not as practical as using the rear of the vehicle. Now, moving on from that, let's talk about seating comfort. And here it's actually really good. The seats themselves are very accommodating and soft, and had no issues both at the front and rear of the cabin. It's also fantastic to see that the front 2 seats are electronically operated, heated and ventilated as standard. The same can be said about the vast majority of its competitors, which give these as an additional option. It's also nice to see that you've got a heated steering wheel and that the rear outer seats are heated as well. Now, there is also a panoramic roof, which is also fitted as standard, and which is fantastic because it draws in some nice light within the cabin. It is also UV protected, so you don't have to worry about getting a suntan while sat within the vehicle. Now, as for headroom and legroom, it's a non-issue at the front of the cabin, while at the rear it can be a little bit more limited. But nonetheless, I think most adults won't have a problem, and it's fantastic to see that you've also got a flat floor, which therefore allows the rear middle occupant to be sat for longer periods of time without that much discomfort. Now, I would like to highlight that there is a pressure sensor within the driver's seat, so each time the driver steps out of the vehicle will power down. Thankfully, over here, you can reinitiate the infotainment or, for example, the climate controls by simply touching on the display, be it at the front with the 15.4-inch display or at the rear with the 8-inch display. So therefore means that you can quickly override the function of the vehicle powering down. Now, on that note, I would like to point out that it's actually pretty intuitive to get out of the vehicle. You've got an electronic door release on all the 4 doors, therefore making it pretty seamless. And yes, when you're driving, you can't actually open the rear doors, so just worth bearing that in mind in case you've got children. Now, getting into the vehicle, however, can be a little bit more of a challenge due to the way that the door handles have been designed. They take a little bit of a technique. It can be pretty easy to get your head around it, but it is worth pointing out that in completely pitch black environments, it can be slightly hard to find your door handle, which isn't a problem on some rival alternatives, which either have a small little light or just have more traditional door handles. Now, I would also like to mention over here that getting in and out of the vehicle, you can use the Tesla app, which is actually really intuitively laid out and provides you a bunch of different controls, such as, for example, preconditioning the cabin, very useful on those colder climate days. If, however, you choose to elect not to use the app for any given reason, you'll have to tap the key card on the B pillar on the driver's side. Now this does actually perfectly lead me onto its exterior design, and subjectively I really do love what Tesla have achieved with the vehicle. It looks a bit more aggressive than the previous generation models, and while it isn't exactly as sporty looking as the performance model, here the long range rear wheel drive certainly does look the part. At the front you've got this really nice flare which goes around the bonnet, and you've also got these really nice slim looking headlights. Then towards the side you have got body coloured wheel arches, and of course that flush design due to those door handles that I just mentioned, and you've got 18-inch Photon wheels that come as standard, or the pictured 19-inch Novas which can be added for an additional £1,500. Just bear in mind what I did mention before when it comes to the overall range. As for the rear, you've got this really nice tail light design with the integrated spoiler, which just adds to the overall look of the vehicle. Quite frankly, I've got no complaints whatsoever, and I really do like the latest generation Teslas in comparison to the older generation ones. Now in terms of your colour options, as standard it comes in white, although you can go for a blue, black or grey, which is pictured for an additional £1,300, while the red and silver finishes will set you back £2,000. So moving swiftly on, let's talk about safety. And here the Model 3 scored 5 out of 5 stars on Euro NCAP's crash test, scoring 96% in adult occupancy, 86% in child occupancy, and a whopping 94% in its safety assist scores. It's also nice to see that you have got a plethora of driver assistance systems that come featured as standard. You've got lane departure avoidance, emergency lane departure avoidance, automatic blind spot camera, which integrates itself within the infotainment system and is a fantastic inclusion each time you're indicating. And you've then got blind spot collision warning chime, blind spot indicator, which is present within the mirror triangles, forward collision warning, automatic emergency braking, obstacle aware acceleration, speed assist, driver drowsy warning, traffic aware cruise control and auto steer, which I absolutely love. Indeed, over here auto steer gives you steering support on the motorway, while the adaptive cruise control does actually work a treat while keeping you at a safe distance from the leading vehicle. It doesn't feel jerky in the slightest. Now, it is also worth pointing out that you can upgrade the experience by going for the enhanced autopilot pack at £3,400. This will give you navigate on autopilot and also auto lane change, which might be something that you might want to consider if you frequent on the motorway. As for the full self-driving pack, FSD for short, this will come in at a whopping £6,800 instead. This will only give you traffic light and stop sign recognition and auto steer on city streets. Given the tight regulations within Europe and in the UK, I do think that the FSD package is a bit of an overkill, while those people in the US will actually benefit from it because it does give you somewhat semi-autonomous driving capabilities. Now moving swiftly on, we get onto visibility, and at the front is actually pretty excellent, although it's worth pointing out that the A-pillars are pretty chunky, so therefore you have to peer around them when you're going around corners or for example around a roundabout. At the side I've got no complaints whatsoever, while at the rear it's a little bit more limited. Thankfully, Tesla include very high resolution rear and side cameras, therefore allowing you to check your surroundings, and you can even initiate the cameras at any given point, including while you're driving on the motorway, by simply tapping a button that's found on the steering wheel. Now finally, this brings me on to something called Tesla Vision, which is a camera-based system, which yes, also integrates the front-faced camera, which you can't actually access yourself, in order to give you a view of your surroundings. It does actually work pretty well in principle, specifically with larger objects. However, in comparison to vehicles that still have ultrasonic sensors, and yes, Tesla has done away with all the ultrasonic sensors on the new Tesla Model 3, I do feel that it slightly struggles with vegetation or smaller sized objects. Therefore, I would have preferred if Tesla had still integrated ultrasonic sensors alongside Tesla Vision to give you the utmost best clarity of your surroundings. So with all that in mind, it brings us on to our verdict of the Tesla Model 3 long-range rear-wheel drive, which in my opinion is the most sensible option, not only if you're looking at the Tesla Model 3 lineup, but also in comparison to some of its key competitors. I think a lot of people coming to an electric vehicle for the first time should probably go for this. Now sure enough, it isn't exactly cheap, and of course it comes in at a premium over the entry-level Tesla Model 3, but then you're getting class-leading electric range as a result of that. Then you have not got the utmost best driving dynamics, but it will suffice for most individuals. It's not got the utmost performance, but yet again, it will be plenty fast. You then also haven't got the best use of technology within the cabin, By that I mean you haven't got an instrument cluster, a head-up display, integration with Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, and of course, more importantly, you've not got any indicator stalks, which will be a bit polarizing to certain individuals. And you haven't got a hatchback design, which therefore makes it a little less practical in comparison to some of its rivals. Nonetheless, the Tesla Model 3 is an absolutely fantastic vehicle, specifically in this configuration, and as such it easily gets our Best Buy awards. Now I'd be curious to know down in the comment section below which vehicle you would pick, be it in terms of the rival alternatives or indeed in terms of the Tesla Model 3 lineup, down in the comment section below. Of course, some of the alternatives that I've mentioned in this video will be down in the description below for your own consideration. And if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.